Um, okay, next up we have, I believe his name is pronounced M. Stauff. Is that the formal pronunciation? Matt Stauffer. He's a strong, well-known community member in the Laravel community, web, whatever. Um, and what can you say about Matt Stauffer? He runs an agency called Titan that Daniel and I are both alumni from,
He used to
and
be our boss.
he used to be our boss.
Used
So
to be.
now, right now he's not, and we can talk back to
Now
him,
we're
and
just friends,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
which is great. So Matt's an incredible guy, an incredible teacher. Jesse noted that I think Jesse succeeded in talking slower, but we'll see. He definitely did for sure. Um, yeah. So I guess like the one thing that I do want to say about Matt is you've been blogging on the internet about tech stuff, Laravel specifically, forever. And I remember like your name was one of the first names I knew in Laravel because I would get stuck on something and you Google it and then you end up on this site. And when you do that enough, you start going like, oh, this Matt Stauffer character. And that was probably like 8 years ago. I don't even know, maybe more. And I'll say that setting up the failed reaction thing, whatever, I had to do some Forge stuff. And where did I end up when I'm like, well, how do I get this? I end up on Matt Stauffer's blog. So
Love
eight
it.
years later, and I'm still ending up on Matt Stauffer's blog. So can't say enough about Matt Stauffer. Daniel, you got anything here? I mean, come on.
Matt's the bomb, dude. Matt's the bomb. Uh, Good boss, good guy, good programmer, great speaker. So
Great
you guys are
speaker.
in for a treat.
Yeah. All right, you ready,
Thanks,
Matt?
guys. I'm ready. Sorry, my audio was off when you made a joke about how my name was pronounced. I heard his. I think his name is pronounced, and then my audio all cut out. So I'm sorry. I
M
missed the
What
staff.
do you
goodness.
think we said? Oh, don't tell him.
It was probably like Stauffer or like something Stauffer or some other traditional mispronunciation,
It's
right?
M Stauf. That
Yeah,
is the
M stuff.
formal.
Yes, yeah. By the way,
it's
anybody who
it's
doesn't
Das
know,
Staff Dog.
Das Staufdog. D Cole is spelled Deekhole forever in my life. So if anybody missed out on that goodness, that is what D Cole is.
That is how you
Um,
spell it.
yeah, yeah. There
Okay,
you go.
we're out of here. Hit it,
All
Matt.
right, thanks, dudes.
All right,
All
Matt,
right,
enjoy.
so I'm going. Oh, I got to get the screen sharing permission.
Caleb, can you hook him up with the screen sharing permission? You got it, baby.
I love it. Every time it says you're the co-host now, I think of the you're the captain now. I'm the
I'm the,
captain now
I'm
from
the co-host now.
yes, exactly. All right, let's see if this. Nope. Let's try it again. Screen two, and then hit the play button. I have not used DeckSet in a long time, as you can see from the fact that I'm on the wrong freaking slides. There we go. Cool. Hey, everybody. My name's Matt. I'm your old friend, your new friend, but I'm your friend. You're stuck with me. That's how I start all of them because it just feels so true. So you'd imagine that the guy giving a talk titled From Vue to Alpine is going to make a pitch for you for why you shouldn't use Vue anymore and Alpine's the best. And I actually really do love Alpine, but I also love Vue. So it's not like this is going to be one of those like Alpine should replace all your Vue things, but there is some interesting context that's going to happen here. So the backstory at Titan, Tighten, like a screw. We're a web consultancy and we work in primarily Laravel on the back end, but in the front end, we got a lot of different spaces where we work. So we work in jQuery, hopefully not, but we'll take over old projects. We've taken over some old projects in Angular, but most of the time going forward, it's going to be vanilla JavaScript, it's going to be Vue, or it's going to be React until Alpine came about. So we had a little bit of a decision matrix for how we decided for a new project what we're going to use for them. So with jQuery, it's just basically, we're never going to use jQuery new. It's only adapting for old stuff. Vanilla JavaScript, though, we still do use new on a pretty regular basis. Simple toggles, hamburgers, especially since we're in the world where a lot of the APIs that JavaScript exposes to the browsers have become more normalized. We don't need jQuery to normalize them across browsers like we did in the past. So I'll always reach for vanilla JavaScript when I can. But when we get to something beyond those really simple things, it's really a question of, is it going to be Vue or React? And so sometimes the needs of the clients impact this. Sometimes who's assigned to the team impacts this. But both of them are going to be really good for full page components, for single page apps, and for some single smaller components. Usually when we were doing just little bits of stuff, like this shouldn't just be vanilla JavaScript, it should be something a little bit more. That's when we would reach for Vue. So when we were converting old sites from jQuery or saying, oh, we need a little bit more than vanilla JavaScript, but it's not going to be a JavaScript heavy page, that's when we would do Vue, right? So a lot of our existing sites have these little sprinkles of Vue everywhere. A quick note here, because I'm going to talk about conversions here. We almost never in any way, shape, or form recommend converting existing frameworks on an existing project. We're never going to come in and be like, you should rewrite this whole thing from scratch in this new framework, because first of all, like there's so much domain knowledge in an existing framework and stuff like that, that the existing code is often intertwined with these existing frameworks. It's not going to be worth it. We do it occasionally in the backend because someone says, hey, we've got this. Well, actually, you do it a lot in the backend when it's not a framework or it's an out-of-date framework, and they say, we want to keep this thing modern. Can you help us convert it bit by bit to Laravel? And so what we'll do is we'll say, all right, we're going to take this piece and that piece. But we're never just going to come in and say, oh, well, you have Vue and we like React better, you should convert. We're not going to do that kind of thing. Unless it's jQuery, we'll always tell you to convert jQuery to something else. So the conversation we could be having today is, where does Alpine fit in that framework I already showed you, right? Where does Alpine fit for new builds? But that's not what I'm most interested in talking about, although I think that's a fantastic conversation. I'm actually going to tell you a little bit of a story that's going to get into a context of from Vue to Alpine instead, and why you would consider doing it. So story time. A couple months ago, I think it was November or December of 2020, the Core Web Vitals was introduced by Google, and it was this idea where, well, I won't tell you the idea yet. They sent a whole bunch of people like me an email saying, hey, your webmaster scores, your SEO scores are about to be significantly changed based on this concept called the Core Web Vitals. You should probably go learn them, because if you have bad Core Web Vital scores, your search results are going to drop. I said, oh my gosh, like, I need to know this for our clients. I'm often the person at Titan who geeks out about performance anyway, so it's kind of like fitting for me to be doing it. I was like, let me start with the Titan website. It's on a static site generator. It's we're talented programmers. It's going to be really good. So I go and I learn the basics. And I don't have time for the whole thing, but I'm going to teach you all just like the really basics. And go check out some other talk sometime. There's tons of resources, including web.dev, which is what this is from, that'll teach you all about these core web vitals. I really recommend that if you ever care about performance for your websites, which most of us should, like front-end performance, you should learn about these things. So real quick, this is just a screenshot from web.dev, and I'm going to give you three, like the high-level basics of what each of these three things are. The core are largest contentful paint, LCP, first input delay, FID, and then cumulative layout shift, CLS. So the largest contentful paint is essentially the biggest thing above the fold. And above the fold means what your user sees before they scroll, right? And so on mobile or desktop, it's just what's in their screen before they scroll. And it is find the biggest element there. How long does it take before that biggest element shows? So if you were, for example, to have a page where you load and there's the nav bar at the top and there's a little bit of content at the bottom, there's a big hero image that takes up the majority of the above the fold, that hero image loading is the moment, like basically the millisecond when that happens, that's the largest contentful paint. So that's the first thing that they're timing. And you can see from here, they have timelines. So it must load within 2.5 seconds for you to get a good rating. The first input delay must be before 100 milliseconds for you to get good rating. So these are these kind of things. So the second one is first input delay. And this one is a little bit less about loading and a little bit more about the browser's brain being ready. If you've ever loaded a thing on an older device or with a lot of complicated JavaScript, you might be familiar with this idea where you're clicking on the thing and it doesn't do anything because the browser is busy churning through your HTML and your CSS and your JavaScript and whatever else to finally get to the point where it can display the page and actually take your clicks. So that first input delay is how long is it before my user can click on a link that they like and actually let that link work. You want that to be really short for your users to be happy. So the first input delay should be under 100 milliseconds. And then the third one is cumulative layout shift. It's the most complicated of all of them. But if you were imagine you load your site and there's a non-loaded image up at the top, but everything else in your site loads really fast. And then when the image loads, it goes chunk because the image was a different perspective, whatever the thing is, width versus height relative to what the browser showed for its default loading thing. And the whole page chunks down some. Google does not like that, right? Google has a big problem with you doing that. And so the CLS is basically how much did it shift? I think it's a fraction, I think, and it needs to be under 0.1. So all of these things are going to be impacted by what we're talking about for the rest of this very short talk. So if you've never had an experience of the tool Lighthouse is a tool that used to be on the web, now is in your browser, but also can be used in the web. But the easiest way is just to open Chrome and go to the far right to the Lighthouse tab and just press the little plus button and run an analysis. It's going to go mobile by default, which is what Google cares about more, but you can also do a desktop analysis. And it's going to check the quality of the site for performance, accessibility, best practices, and SEO. Only care about performance right now. The rest of them are great. Accessibility especially is very important, but performance is what we're talking about today. And you can see in the screenshot here that I've actually got the performance one and the 6 items underneath it shown to you. So this is what the Titan website looks like now. It's not what it looked like when that email came out. And you can see that the core web vitals, cumulative layout shift, and first contentful paint are there. And I actually wish I'd remembered to look this up, but the first input delay is either time to interactive or I think it's time to interactive. It's either exactly time to interactive or it's very, very similar. So that's one thing to note, is that I don't remember that one, but that's not the point of this talk, so that's okay. But you do have first content full paint and cumulative layout shift, which are the biggest and most important things for you to consider based on what I'm talking about today. All right, so quick story time. I get that email. I'm like, great, I'm going to run it to the Titan website. And again, it's a static site generator, so the initial delivery is going to be really fast. There's very little JavaScript going on. We're very talented programmers. We're going to get really good ratings, right? Totally. Turns out we didn't. And I was like, this is completely not what I expected for this wonderful website that we built. Now, granted, there's a little bit of the, what is it? The cobbler's children have no shoes, right? Like you pay more attention to your clients than you do to your own website. And that's certainly been the case for us historically. But I was still surprised, a little disappointed. So I had to dig in through Lighthouse to try to figure out, what is the source of these performance numbers? Why are we getting a 60 instead of 100? So I walked through them, and there's really three pieces of trouble and then a whole bunch of miscellany. So the first thing was web fonts. I'm not going to talk about it today, but I would just tell you, avoid web fonts if you can. And if you can't avoid them, pay some attention. There's a couple really great resources that I'll try and tweet out after this of which web font sources you can use and which of them allow you and don't allow you to do the optimizations. There's a lot of optimizations we can use for web fonts, but there's one key offender who doesn't let you, which is I think it's typography.com, which is what we use for one of our fonts, and they don't let you do it. So it just killed me. Most of the web font providers you can use with some of these optimizations, so you won't die too much on that. Okay, that was our biggest hit. Second thing was, we did have some old really nice visual plugins that were jQuery based that there weren't any good replications for, and I didn't want to rewrite from scratch. So I made those only load in the sections of the site that they need to be instead of being global. That was great. There was some other miscellany, but there was one big offender, and it was Vue. Vue.js, my buddy, my pal, was the number one, after web fonts, was the number one biggest offender for our score being not great. And I was just so surprised. So I looked through this little waterfall thing that shows us in loading this thing, what is your browser actually doing? Because a lot of the waterfalls we look at are just the network waterfalls, right? This thing loaded, then this thing loaded, then that thing loaded, which is good. You can learn about, should things be loaded in the header or the footer, should you use the defer or the async or whatever. Those things are all good things to learn. But when you come in here, you learn more. And this is something that when you run the Lighthouse test, you can just click view original stack trace or something, or view original waterfall or something, and it shows you this. And what is really cool is that you can see the tasks that the browser was given at the top, that little gray section. And then below that, it can tell you each thing that happened that kicked off which thing would happen. So when I clicked on this parse HTML thing, I said, this is obviously the biggest problem we have here. This big, long time, what's going on? And I discovered that this evaluate script block here, I wish I had the times in here, but this is an old screenshot, but I feel like it was several hundred milliseconds to evaluate the script. And this script right here was Vue itself being evaluated. And I discovered that there's actually some burden that comes in from the browser, literally just parsing through the entirety of Vue that's certainly worth it in the vast majority of our sites. But when I'm just using Vue for a little hamburger or for a little modal, maybe it's not actually worth it in that context. So again, this is not trash talking Vue. Every JavaScript framework has some problem like this. And this does not mean that I don't love Vue all the time, but it does mean that the boundary point at which I decide to use Vue in a project just maybe changed a little bit. So I had actually been using Alpine in a lot of new projects, and I knew it was really light. So I just said, you know what, I'm just going to go try it out and figure it out. Alpine reminds me very much of a cross between vanilla JavaScript, which I love. I love to use it as much as possible, and Vue, which I love. I also love React, but React, it's got to be pretty heavy for me to choose to use React. So I was like, Alpine might be in the space between our original metric of, vanilla JavaScript and Vue in terms of its lightness. So I look it up, and it turns out that Alpine is great for core web vitals, and this is really wonderful news. The download size for Alpine and Vue off of jsdeliver.net is a factor of 10, right? Now, download size is not everything, but again, when we're talking about these big sites that have almost no JavaScript, if I can cut something down to a 10th of the size just in terms of loading it, this is a really good thing. And even with caching and gzip, all these tests are running as if it's somebody's first approach to your website from Google, right? And so you don't get caching. And you don't get access to a lot of the conveniences that we rely on, like, oh, I'm going to set my e-tags great. Well, it doesn't matter if it's their first visit to the site. So this right here is going to be a little bit hard to see, and sorry, especially if any of you are on lower resolution, but you've got two sites that are exactly the same site, left and right. Left side is Vue, right side is Alpine, and they're not doing anything. It has the words hello world from Vue, hello world from Alpine, and it loads those exact same files I just showed you from JSDeliver, and that's it, nothing else. And you can already notice that they're a little bit different. Vue is getting that 98% score. Alpines get that 100% score. And when you look at those you see all those little labels there, DCL, L, FP, FCP, LCP, those are all the different events that are triggered by the browser. So FCP is first content full paint, LCP is largest contentful paint. FP is first paint. DCL is something DOM content loaded. So all these different events that matter in different ways, when the JavaScript starts processing or when this core web vital kicks off. So just baseline, seeing those numbers be so different is already pretty shocking to me. And then I built a really simple script. And thankfully, it actually got a little bit less distinct between the two after I did that. So I'm still not 100% sure why. But once I did a simple hamburger, you notice that the initial, the first paint and the first contentful paint got closer. And the weird thing is on the view one, it actually looks like it's like 100 milliseconds now instead of 250. So again, this is one of the things where you got to run these things lots of times. It's not perfect math here, but I ran this one a whole bunch of times. And every single time I saw that they're relatively similar, but you are getting a speed boost from using Alpine. Also with Alpine, you're noticing that DOM content loaded and content loaded, which is not a part of Core Web Vitals, is noticeably different. But then also the largest contentful paint also pushes out a little bit further. So it's one of these where it's like the last slide made it look like, oh my God, Alpine is so much better than Vue. It is better in these contexts, but I do want to note that once you start getting into the code, the specific code you're writing and the way the browser has to process it, they get more similar, but it's still going to make a big difference in the end. So in the end, what I ended up saying is our new matrix has to be not just what can each framework do, but what can each do with the smallest payload. And that is something that would take that first matrix I showed you at the beginning and kind of make it a little bit more robust. But again, that's not the goal today. The goal today is really to think about in what circumstances is it worth taking an existing application where we use sprinklings of Vue and convert them to Alpine. So I'm going to give you two really quick examples. The goal for these examples are to target somebody who already knows Vue, but may not be super familiar with Alpine. So if you're watching Alpine Day because you use Alpine every single day, this might be old hat for you. I'm going to try and breeze through it pretty quickly. You might learn some robustness from this. And a note, my second example is actually a modal, which there's a fantastic talk earlier today of modals and how to do them really well. So I would recommend that if you're coming to this after the fact, you're not watching Alpine Day live, you go back and watch the talk about accessible modals. It was really good and it covers so much more than what I'm doing here. But again, if you're new to Alpine, especially if you're thinking about converting old Alpine stuff over to Vue or old Vue stuff over to Alpine, I want to give you two really quick examples of some patterns that will make your Alpine feel more like Vue and therefore make the conversion process easier. First one is converting a hamburger menu. Hamburger menu in Vue is really simple, right? We've got our template, which with a click handler and the button that says the hamburger. And then when you do that, it runs a toggle method. The toggle method says, if we're showing right now, do the close method. If we're not showing right now, do the open method. And then that basically toggles the state of this true variable. So that div v show equals show div, that's where our content is showing or not showing, right? And the only reason we're even using these open and close methods is because I also want to bind a key down listener so that when somebody hits escape, it pops that modal or that drop down back up. And that's about it. So you can see it's pretty simple. If we weren't doing the key down listener, this would be even simpler because we could literally just say @click show equals bang show, right? That would be it. But because the key down listener, it gets to be a little bit more work. So if you were to take the same toggle and you were to rewrite it in Alpine, it would look like this. And I'm not just trying to show how Alpine is great, but one of the things that I love about Alpine is that a lot of the things that we write all the time are just built in. So the key down.escape.window handler there is just freaking beautiful, right? Like they made it so much easier. And we have this concept of, I want to be able to bind this key and it's just bound and we don't have to worry about it. But in the end, this is very, very similar, right? Again, the point is not that like this is better, because there's probably some Vue optimizations I could have made there that some of y'all who are Vue, gurus could teach me about, right? The point is that this conversion was very easy, right? Like if you choose to convert for the purpose of performance, the conversion's not going to be that painful. Now, converting the modal is going to be more work, but I'm going to show how it's not quite as more work as you might have imagined. So this is what our contact modal looks like in Vue. So we actually have two components, one of them, which is the contact modal component, which I'll show you in a second. But the first one here is the modal component, which is a component we intend to use in lots of modals. So you basically have a full screen div, which is showing if you have this show property set to true. It's got a close button, and then it's got a slot for you to put the content of the div in it, right? And your props are the show thing, which allows us to define ahead of time whether we're showing it. And then it's got its own internal data, although I don't see the data here. I think I might have accidentally deleted it for this show property. Or I think I might have wrote props show and I meant to write data show. Anyway, you understand the general concept is we're keeping track of this show property. We've got a method for open and a method for close. And I believe in this particular one, I'm missing the data being set. So sorry, I tried to extract these down. But in essence, you basically have a modal here with an open method that does your keyboard listener. You got this, the close method has a keyboard listener, and I apparently forgot to also write the whole thing with setting this show data to true or false. But in general, you can see that this is almost exactly the same as what we did with the dropdown. What's interesting here, though, is that if you look at the contact modal component, we are using that modal component inside our contact modal component. So this contact modal component is really just using that modal without any really deep knowledge about modals here. And then what this is more of just a contact form, right? And this contact form could be something else if it was a modal that didn't have a contact form in it. But this particular modal has a contact form in it. So all it's really doing is keeping track of the data, binding the name as form.name and the email as form.email up to those inputs. And then it has a method for checking if the form is valid and a method for submitting the form if it's valid. Okay, so this is a familiar pattern. Again, I'm not going to go into those specifics, but imagine that that's what your contact form looked like, because it's what R looked like. So converting this to Alpine is a little different. Now in Alpine, you don't necessarily have the same context of components, right? So we'd start building this modal. This modal is not a component. This is just a modal. If we need to make another modal, we would copy this content later. But first, let's just look at it. You've got your initial data with whether we're showing it or not. You've got your key binding, just like we showed before. You've got the open modal button. You've got the close modal button. You've got away handling, which I actually hadn't even written in the view. Again, click away handling is so much easier in Alpine. It's just another of those convenience it gives us. And then you got your content. This makes sense. It's easy, but it's not necessarily a component that we can work with in the same way, right? It's not something that has a slot for the content. So we're a little bit unsure about this. But there's some really interesting extractions that we can do. One of the first things you can do, as you saw, again, if you saw the talk this morning about modals, you already got this. But for those who are new, you can take everything that's in X data and you make it a function. And so we just set our initial data setting there. But notice that if we were to apply this X data equals modal to every single modal, we're doing a little bit of extraction, but we still have to apply things like at keydown.escape.window, right? And as you saw this morning, if you were here this morning, we can also take all of the other parameters we're applying to this thing, whether it's an X dash on something or anything else, and use the spread thing. And it basically takes all of the entries in modal spread there and applies them as properties to this div. And it can be this div or it can be one of the child divs. So cool thing is now that you say X data equals modal, X spread equals modal spread, we can now define all the properties, all the aspects that we want about this just by running this modal thing and this modal spread thing. And so by doing that, we now can apply those to anything, and those things inherit all this behavior, sort of like a component, right? So here's our contact modal script, which is a script just like our contact modal script in Vue. But again, this has no knowledge of modals, right? It's got the form data, it's got a form as valid method, it's got a submit form method, exactly like it had in Vue. I just copied those directly over from Vue. And the most interesting thing is, how do you do this kind of like shared component state thing? And so that's where things get really interesting, and you may not have the opportunity to work with this. If you use these spreads here, you can have a div that applies multiple of those functions at the same time. So you use the spread operator on modal, the spread operator in contact modal, you put them in that object, and now both of their sets of data and both of their sets of methods are going to be applied. Similar to spread. If we had set up a contact modal spread in that one, you can apply both of them there. And then the template inside here looks exactly like the template did in the other one. So that's what's really cool about this. Now you have to do a little bit of work to get the templating part of the modal in here. So it's not exactly the same. I know I don't have a time to go into that, but basically to show you, while it is a little bit more like the Tailwind mindset, right? You're setting everything up in your HTML. You're not building the single page or the single file component ahead of time and then using it in here. There's a lot of opportunities for data reuse. There's a lot of opportunities for extracting those sets of methods and sets of data that were in your Vue components in exactly the same way. So it's not as hard as it may seem to rewrite them this way, but most importantly, there's actually a big reason to consider doing it, which is this whole performance concern. So I'm a little out of time, so I would just say the most important thing for you going forward is, I would recommend you consider moving from Vue to Alpine if you've got simple stuff, hamburgers and toggles, modals and accordions, widgets, stuff that we would have used jQuery for in the past. This is a really great moment for you to actually not just consider using Alpine going forward, but even consider rewriting from Vue to Alpine for performance reasons. If you said we're using Vue because this is too complex for vanilla JavaScript, really fantastic time to consider Alpine. Moving. Now, this is not a list right here of things that you can't do in Alpine. This is a list of things that if you're doing this in Vue, I wouldn't necessarily recommend rewriting it. And this is full page components, tons of component nesting, SPAs, most major dashboards. I'm not saying whether or not you use Alpine for these. I'm saying if you've got these in Vue, keep them in Vue. So your next steps, and then I'll be done, is if you're using Vue for minor JavaScript anywhere, because at least it's better than jQuery, go run Lighthouse on that site, see how you perform, and then try converting over to Alpine and see how it treats you. So hope that helps, and let me know on @StaufferMatt on Twitter if you have any questions.
Thank you, Matt Stauffer.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome stuff.
Matt, good job, bud.
Good job, Matt. A lot of good content there. Tons of good content. That's great. So we got a break coming up.